For over a century, the US has intervened, invaded, or supported coups in almost every country in the Americas, and treated its southern neighbors with contempt.
The Western Hemisphere is our backyard.
But a new wave of democratically elected left-wing leaders are no longer putting up with it. My guest tonight was at the heart of US Latin American policy under the last 3 Republican presidents and advocates a much stronger hand against Cuba and Venezuela. I'm Mehdi Hasan, and I've come here to the Oxford Union to go head-to-head with Otto Reich. I'll be asking why many in Latin America see him as the personification of US imperialism and whether his country's guilty of bullying its neighbors. Tonight, I'll also be joined by Dr. Julia Buxton, a specialist on Venezuela and the war on drugs at the Central European University. John Dew, former British ambassador to Cuba and Colombia and a former political attaché in Venezuela. And Dr. Francisco Dominguez, head of the Latin American Studies Center at Middlesex University and secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Otto Reich. George W. Bush's top official for Latin America, he was also linked to the Iran-Contra affair under President Reagan. Thanks so much for coming. Otto Reich, what would you say to those who argue that for far too long, the United States has treated Latin America rather dismissively, rather high-handedly, as its backyard? You hear that phrase often. In fact, Secretary of State John Kerry used the phrase backyard just last year. What would you say to people who say that's the attitude of America, of the United States of America, looks down on the rest of the region?
Well, I would say that he should not have used the term backyard. I've never used it. I haven't heard people in a Republican administration. I don't want to get too partisan, but...
He's a Democrat, obviously, and you were a Republican,
right.
Or are a Republican.
Your question leads to a misunderstanding on the part of both Latin Americans and the United States. They think that even the term backyard, which I do not think should be used, is pejorative. Backyard in American society is where the family gets together for its most intimate moments.
That's a good spin.
Well, it happens to be true. I use the term neighborhood. I think Latin America is our neighborhood. If something happens in our neighborhood, it affects us, and vice versa.
And are you the neighborhood watch? Are you in charge of that neighborhood?
We have been, unfortunately, because as in many neighborhoods, there are some very bad people in the world, and there's been some very bad people in Latin America, and I've been involved in cases where Latin Americans have asked us to intervene in their countries.
The United States has clearly done a lot of good things in Latin America, let's be clear about that. At the same time, surely you would accept that the US also has a pretty blood-stained record, supporting coups, dictators across the region. Somoza in Nicaragua, Pinochet in Chile, Stroessner in Paraguay, Batista in Cuba, death squads in Honduras, genocidal military dictators in Guatemala. So you would surely not deny any of that, the blood-stained historical record in that neighborhood.
If you look at the historical record, there's no question that many United States governments made a lot of mistakes and supported the wrong people. You mentioned just about the entire panoply of mistakes.
Mistakes? Is that what you would call them?
Well, I mean, mistakes from the perspective of where we stand today. Yes, in retrospect, they were mistakes. We're also the country that got rid of several of the people that you mentioned.
That doesn't make the initial crime any better, does it?
Well, I'm not sure there was a crime.
If you take Guatemala, for example, General Rios Montt, who was the dictator there, who went to jail for genocide. Ronald Reagan, your former boss, went to visit him in 1982, and after coming out of the meeting, he said he's a man of great integrity, he's committed to democracy, he's getting, quote, a bum rap from human rights groups. A UN Truth Commission said he couldn't have done that without US military aid and support.
Okay.
Genocide, 200,000 people died.
I was in the Reagan administration in 1982. I don't recall that visit.
The fact that you don't recall the visit doesn't mean it didn't happen, with respect. So the UN Truth Commission report that involved US testimony and Guatemalan testimony and experts from outside, which said that Guatemalan military would not have been able to carry out their genocide in the 80s had it not been for US support. You don't agree with that?
There was no US support.
There was no US support for real
no US military.
And Reagan never said he was getting a bum rap.
I don't recall President Reagan ever making that statement. I do recall this. When Reagan came in 1981, over 60% of the population of Latin America lived under military dictatorships. When he left in 1989, over 60% of the population lived in democracies.
And all of those places, hundreds of thousands of people died, killed by military forces, paramilitaries, armed by the US, supported by the US, trained by the US, funded by the US.
Not true.
Okay, let's talk about Venezuela. You were President Reagan's ambassador there in the late 1980s.
That's right.
You were President George W. Bush's Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, basically for Latin America. You were in that post in 2002 when Hugo Chavez was removed from office in a coup. Was the United States government, were you, Otto, involved in any shape or form in that coup? Because a lot of people believe you were.
We were not involved. Let me say that right from the outset. This was not a coup organized by the United States. This was the reaction by the military high command to an illegal order that Chavez gave to fire on the people of Venezuela. And it was not a coup. I mean, this was a mutiny. When Chavez gave that order to fire on the people, the military high command all went on national television and said, I did not take the oath to defend this country by firing, I'm not going to do that, by firing on the people of Venezuela.
You say it wasn't a coup.
And they went to the presidential palace and told Chavez, you're finished. Now, if you want to call that a coup, that's fine. I call it a mutiny.
When you say, do I want to call it a coup?
You just did.
Week before the coup, the CIA called it a coup. The CIA in 2002 circulated a document a week before the coup, the mutiny, which was then only revealed in 2004.
How could the CIA have called it a coup a week before?
Well, there you go. This is a CIA briefing. It goes out to several members of the Bush administration. I'm not sure if you were on the list. Guess what the memo is called from the CIA? Conditions are ripening for a coup attempt. Dissident military factions, including some disgruntled senior officers, are stepping up efforts to organize a coup against President Chavez, possibly as early as this month.
Oh, yeah. Conditions were definitely pointing in that direction. And would cause
Did you get this
no, I did not. I did not. I left the White House, after the State Department went to the White House, left in 2004. So I would not have been on the
This is from April 2002. This is from a week before the coup. You were the Assistant Secretary of State.
No, I thought you said it was 2004 that it came
it was
out.
only released in 2004.
No,
we only got to see that you guys weren't telling the full truth in 2004. Listen to this bit. This is good. To provoke military action, the plotters may try to exploit unrest stemming from opposition demonstrations later this month. It's exactly what you just described.
Of course, everybody knew the conditions were there. But the detonator was Chavez's illegal order to fire on the people. And it was illegal by his own constitution.
And you were happy to see him go.
I was happy to see him go,
You're not a fan of a man who won 4 elections in Venezuela?
I'm not sure that he won 4 elections in Venezuela, but I was happy to see him go.
What did he do? What did he do with them then?
Do you think that these elections in Venezuela have been free and fair and transparent?
Some might say they were freer and fairer than the one that got your boss elected in 2000 in Florida.
Well, they can say it. That's fine. If they can show me a Supreme Court, as in the United States, that wasn't appointed by Chavez, but in the case of the Supreme Court of Venezuela, they were all appointed by Chavez at some point. Then I would say, well, they may have a point.
In 2004, for example, thanks to good old WikiLeaks, we discovered that the US ambassador, his strategy, which he laid down to his team, penetrating Chavez's political base, dividing Chavismo, isolating Chavez internationally. If a foreign ambassador arrived in Washington, D.C. and had that as their set of goals about the US government, how would you feel about that?
Oh, the US media does that. They don't need a foreign ambassador to do that.
But you take my point.
There's no question that we helped train, for example, private volunteer NGOs, non-governmental organizations, in community organizing. Because in Venezuela, there was practically no history of civic involvement and civic organization. But this is nothing. Whatever we did was nothing compared to what we did in Eastern Europe to help bring down those dictatorships. And I was very happy to see them go. And I would have been very happy to see Chavez go at that moment, especially since we had nothing to do with it.
You don't believe Chavez was a totalitarian dictator, do you?
No, I've actually said, and a lot of my Venezuelan friends have been upset, there's still not even a dictatorship today. It is very much an authoritarian regime. It has totally eliminated the free press. by either intimidating it or buying it. There's no more of the old Fidel Castro supporting guerrilla movements. Now what they do, as in Chavez, Morales, Correa in Ecuador, etc., they win an election, and that's the last free election that is held in that country. The military, the police...
Hugo Chavez lost a referendum and abided by it.
Which one?
In 2007, I believe, on constitutional reform and extending the term limits.
Yeah, exactly. But the one that he...
And he abided by the results.
The one that he really lost, and then he changed the results was in 2004. August 15 of 2004.
We've got to move on just very quickly. Many would say that the reason the US had a problem with Chavez and other left-wing leaders is because they don't follow a US political or economic agenda. In Venezuela, Chavez did a lot to help the poor, to help people who were struggling under previous governments, didn't maybe help the rich so much, didn't help the elites. Why don't you applaud Chavez for reducing poverty by half, absolute poverty by 70%?
Because he did.
Increasing the number of...
Number one, because he did. Number
two... Those are the
two,
World Bank's figures.
Wait a second.
That well-known communist organization.
Where does the World Bank get its statistics?
You tell me.
From the countries themselves.
Oh, so it's all manufactured statistics?
Absolutely. I will tell you, he did reach out to the poor of Venezuela that had been ignored by the elites. But Chavez, at the same time, was interfering in the internal affairs of his neighbors, providing weapons to the FARC in Colombia, and you know there's a lot of evidence of that, real evidence, not put out by the UN or the World Bank.
Disputed evidence. One last question on Venezuela, because we have to move on. You once called Hugo Chavez a president of, quote, limited intellectual powers. Do you see the irony of someone who once worked for George W. Bush mocking the intellect of other world leaders?
I believe it is true. He did graduate from Harvard and Yale, so that kind of, I mean, Bush, not Chavez.
I'm sure Daddy didn't help at all. Let's bring in our panel here. I want to come first to Professor Julia Buxton, who's a specialist on Latin America at the Central European University in Budapest. Otto doesn't think Venezuela was very democratic under Chavez, that he didn't win four elections freely or fairly. I believe you were an international observer at some of those elections. Do you agree with Otto's take on that?
Well, I'm really struggling with this very deceptive presentation of what's actually happened in Venezuela. It's quite a staggering rewriting of the history under Chavez. I've observed elections in Venezuela on 5 occasions. We're talking about an electoral system which is technocratically advanced. People vote, that vote goes directly to the National Electoral Council, people receive a ballot slip, it's fully audited. One of the big criticisms we had from the opposition on the two last elections I observed, 2006 and 2013, was this claim that people were being intimidated at the ballot boxes, that Chavistas were riding around on motorcycles and intimidating them. There was no evidence of this. We saw no evidence of this in any of the areas that we were sent to observe.
You have heard, you said that there was no evidence that voters were intimidated. You've heard of the Lista Tascón and the Lista Maizanta. You've heard of the fact that the government required all of its workers to put their fingerprint in order to vote. And people were told, whether it happened or not, that the government would know exactly how the person with this fingerprint voted, whether yes or no. I know very few Venezuelans that would agree with Ms. Buxton's description of the election, of the transparency
apart from
and
the
fairness.
majorities who voted for Chavez 4 times?
No, it was not a majority. That's the point.
Okay.
We will never know, actually, because they destroyed the ballot.
This is starting to sound a lot like Florida. John Dew is the former British ambassador to Cuba and Colombia, and also served as a political attaché in Venezuela, I believe, in the 70s. When you listen to Otto speak about the US-Venezuela relationship, what perspective do you bring to this debate as a former British diplomat?
I think how things have changed. I mean, we're still not clear what Otto is supposed to have done in 2002. It doesn't amount to very much. Compared with 73 coup in Chile, Pinochet, what on earth are we talking about in Venezuela? A few phone calls?
So your point is, compared to previous US interventions, which were much more heavy-handed, Venezuela in 2002 was a bit of a mild one.
The historical record is that things are getting better all the time.
Okay, let's bring in Dr. Francisco Dominguez, who is head of Latin American Studies at Middlesex University. He's secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. I want to ask you 2 very quick questions, if you could take them. One is, do you accept this view that US interventions, military interventions, undemocratic interventions are a thing of the past in the region? And the other question is, the economy. We hear so much about the Chavez record. Otto says it's all made up.
All the figures from the Venezuelan economy are verified by the Economic Commission for Latin America. It is one of the best bona fide sources of information and data. And you can double check every single figure that the Venezuelan government gives. The second point is, anybody who believes that U.S. interventions and destabilization plans in Latin America come to an end, they should go and get their brains examined. Because it's as heavy as before, but it's different. It doesn't have the same format. The basic idea is to penetrate society from within through monies, NGOs, all sorts of bodies, and so on. The National Endowment for Democracy has channeled about $120 million to opposition groups in Venezuela.
Okay. Just want to turn to a country which you have described as a dictatorship, which many would describe as a dictatorship. You were born in Cuba, I believe. Everything the US has done in Cuba, from trying to assassinate Castro with an exploding cigar to putting an embargo on that island, many would say it's been 50 years of failure, this embargo, which persists. And I would say to you, Einstein is often quoted as saying that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. So on that basis, your Cuba policy is insane.
Well, I guess it wasn't designed by Einstein.
No.
But Einstein wasn't a politician. I'll tell you what's insane. What's insane is that you have a government in Cuba that has been in power for 55 years with no freedoms, not one single free media, and yet in all of the great halls of academia in the world, what people focus on is Fidel Castro's principal obsession, which is removing the embargo. The embargo will stay in place as long as it brings a cost to Fidel Castro of eliminating all of the freedoms of the people in Cuba.
Some would say, actually, Castro's not bent on removing the embargo. He quite likes the embargo because it doesn't hurt him, it hurts the people, and he gets to blame America for all the problems. So why not lift the embargo and not give him an excuse to blame America for everything? It hasn't worked, your embargo.
The embargo is symbolic, Mehdi. It's symbolic. There's not one single
it's not symbolic
product.
to people who are suffering from it.
No, they're not. They're suffering from 55 years of Marxist economics. That's what they're suffering from. They're suffering from the fact that they cannot establish a private business without the permission of the government, and once they start making money, the Castros will take the permit away from them.
So you wouldn't be in favor of easing the embargo in any way, lifting certain restrictions,
No, I would
keeping
not.
it as it is?
Keeping it as it is.
And that's because Castro's undemocratic, no freedoms.
No, undemocratic is too kind.
Fine. Your old boss, President Bush, in 2008, came out of the White House, did a press conference, announced that he was going to lift a range of key financial sanctions under the Trading with the Enemy Act, which Cuba is also subjected to, on North Korea. In what world is North Korea somehow less oppressive or less undemocratic than Cuba under Castro? Seriously?
You want to know what I think about that? President Bush made a mistake. We know that now.
How about China? Would you put China under an embargo? Communist China. Forget communist Cuba. America's China's biggest trading partner.
Do you realize,
you can trade with China, but not with Cuba. How does that work?
The differences between China and Cuba are...
That China is far more oppressive.
In political
Kills
terms,
far more people.
I don't know. I mean,
but also
it has certainly
lets you
killed
borrow a lot
far
of
more
money.
people. But the changes in China have been real. There are no changes in Cuba.
One last question on Cuba before we go back to the panel and move on. You've called the Cuban government not just a dictatorship, you called it a terrorist government, a sponsor of terrorism. Yet you yourself are accused of having lobbied for Orlando Bosch, who was a Cuban-American terrorist.
Right.
Many people have said that you lobbied for him to be given safe haven in the US. This is a man who was accused of bringing down a Cuban airliner, killing 76 people on board. The US Justice Department called him, said he advocated, encouraged, organized in acts of terrorist violence. Orlando Bosch died a free man in 2011 in Miami, Florida.
Right.
Do you see how a lot of Cubans get annoyed about that you talk about terrorism, but you support anti-Castro terrorists?
I'll tell you why I get annoyed. Because you have just repeated the Cuban government propaganda line, which is absolutely false, and I can prove it. Orlando Bosch came to the embassy when I was ambassador. He was turned down. He was rejected. He did not qualify.
And yet, when he got to America...
Anybody who reaches the United States, even if they've been accused by the Cuban government, a terrorist government, he was accused. He was never found guilty. But I'm not going to defend. I never met the man. I never had any dealings with him.
He was a terrorist, though.
I don't know.
Why?
I was not in the trial.
Somebody who brings down an airliner is not a terrorist.
How do you know he brought down that airliner?
Well,
it was not proven in the Venezuelan court.
Dick Thornburgh, who was Ronald Reagan and George Bush's Attorney General, he called Bosch an unrepentant terrorist. All I'm asking is, would you say the same?
Absolutely. If he committed that crime, he's a criminal.
Okay, let's go back to our panel. John Dew.
I don't have the evidence.
John Dew, you were ambassador in Cuba. If you look today, the British government, the EU, is also opposed to the US embargo. Do you think the US is really isolated still on this subject today in the international community?
Well, it's certainly isolated because the only country that supports the US on the embargo every year in the UN is the Marshall Islands, which is not really a sort of sign of great credibility. I think the embargo is out of date. It may have made sense in the Cold War, makes no sense now. It's also incoherent because the US is the biggest supplier of agricultural produce to Cuba. What kind of embargo is that?
Let me bring in Francisco Dominguez. It's Marxist economics that's failed Cuba, not the embargo. It's the way they've run their economy. There are no freedoms there, as Otto Reich pointed out. What would you say in response?
I mean, the economic weight of the United States is huge. It's enormous. You cannot buy aspirins in the United States. You're Cuba. You need to buy rice from China, which is very expensive because transport costs. You cannot buy antibiotics and so on. The application of the blockade goes further because it applies sanctions to third countries that actually trade with Cuba. And the result is that the United States has a very active policy of deterring trade between Cuba and every other country that it can. And it threatens Latin America when Latin America doesn't. It doesn't have any effect anymore. So it definitely has had a tremendous effect.
Julia, what do you think the US relationship with Cuba tells us about the wider region, this kind of focus on Cuba, this embargo, this non-shifting policy? What does it tell you?
Well, I mean, the United States has always seen Latin America as within its sphere of influence. I mean, going right back to the 1820s and the Monroe Doctrine, Latin America has been central to US security considerations. And I think Cuba just really represents this unending US interference in the region. We can look back over the last 100, 200 years, and we can't really say that US engagement in the region has delivered any major dividends or benefits to South America. Absolutely on the contrary, and I think Cuba is really a manifestation of this.
Well, on that note, before we go to a break, Julia mentioned major dividends to people. Over the past decade, and I think you mentioned earlier in the program, Latin American voters have elected left-wing governments that haven't quite been had the best of relationships with the United States, which have stood up to the United States in Venezuela, in Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia. Is that evidence that Latin Americans are finally fed up of US interfering in the quote-unquote backyard and are saying, you know what, we're going to elect who we want to elect, and if you don't like them, tough? Is that the message you think that you're being sent?
Is that a rhetorical question? Because, I mean, they've always elected who they wanted to elect, especially as the ambassador said, you know, since the United States, frankly, has paid a lot less attention to the region lately, and I think that's not good. The difference, again, let's say if you want to call them leftist governments, the difference in the leftist governments is a Chavez versus a Lula da Silva in Brazil.
But let's be clear, Lula was also a big critic of American policy.
Yes, he was. But you know what? With President Bush, whose intelligence you derided a little earlier, during the 6 years that they overlapped...
Trust me, I'm not alone on that.
They got... No, I know, but don't worry. I mean...
You're the one who said he made a bad move on North Korea, but anyway.
He did make a bad move on North Korea. That's because I'd left the government. But...
He couldn't get you through Congress. He couldn't get you approved.
But have you ever sat down and talked to President Bush privately?
I'd love to. Could you set that up?
I probably could.
Well, let's get him on this show.
But you're going to have to get better sources, though, for your information.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a tough one with George W. Bush.
Yes, exactly.
On that note, we're going to have to take a break there. We will be back in part 2, where we will be talking about groups in Latin America that the United States has supported that some would say are terrorists. I'll be getting Otto Reich's views on that. And we'll also be hearing from our very patient audience here in the Oxford Union. Join us for part 2 of Head to Head. Welcome back. You're watching Head to Head on Al Jazeera English. My guest here today is Otto Reich, former point man on Latin America for Presidents Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. Back in the early 2000s. Otto, during the Cold War, you were at the heart of some of President Reagan's policies towards Latin America. You were the director of the Office for Public Diplomacy. You were actively working to get rid of the left-wing Sandinistas in Nicaragua. You were also linked to one of the most controversial episodes of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the Iran-Contra affair in the mid-1980s, which saw the US secretly selling weapons to Iran via Israel in order to fund the anti-communist paramilitary group in Nicaragua, well, let's be honest, terrorist group in Nicaragua, the Contras. And you cut some corners, some would argue. An official investigation in 1987 into the Iran-Contra scandal accused you and your office of carrying out, quote, prohibited, covert, propaganda activities beyond the range of acceptable public information activities. So what I wanted to ask you was, Is this how the US tries to make its case on Latin American problems, through covert propaganda activities?
Well, first of all, it was not covert propaganda. It was only overt. The reason the office was established was because President Reagan himself felt that the information that he was seeing in newspapers or on television was completely opposite of what he was seeing in the information provided by U.S. government sources, embassies, the State Department, or the CIA, or the Defense Department. And there's no question, Mehdi, that at that time, the American media was determined to undermine President Reagan's policy. They didn't like it. The fact is that the policies were correct.
You and your office planted stories in the papers to make Nicaragua look bad, the US government look good. It was called white propaganda, I believe.
No, do you know what white propaganda means?
You tell me.
It's advertising.
Okay.
We declassified information and we put it out to the press. We spoon-fed them. They didn't swallow it if they didn't want it, or if they didn't believe it.
US
Everything
press,
we provided,
everything.
Would you
You
read
didn't
from?
plant stories.
No, we did not plant stories.
This is a declassified document
Yes.
sent to Pat Buchanan, communications director at the White House,
Right.
from your office,
Right. And it mentioned white propaganda.
called white propaganda.
Again, what is white propaganda?
Well, let's read it. Attached is a copy of an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Professor Gil Martin has been a consultant to our office and collaborated with our staff in writing the piece. It's devastating in its analysis of the Nicaraguan arms buildup. Officially, this office had no role in its
And
preparation.
unofficially, this office had no role because the man did not work for us.
So you collaborate in writing an op-ed piece?
Don't you mean the
public should know that the American government is helping writing op-ed
That was
pieces?
written by Jonathan Miller, who was trying to get a job in the White House.
Oh, I see. So it's all false, this document?
No,
Everything in it.
no, not false.
When
If
it
you
says-
read it carefully,
We're having opposition leaders meet through cutouts.
right. This is a young man, a very young man in his 20s, who was enamored of CIA terms like cutouts.
Okay.
You know, what we met, of course we met with opposition leaders, hundreds of them.
We're
How
preparing,
else are we gonna
we're
get
preparing
information?
two op-eds for the Washington Post and the New York Times, and we're going to put the signatures of opposition leaders on them. Sounds
Well,
great.
that
Sounds
never
very
happened.
democratic.
That
Never
never
happened.
That did not happen.
Okay.
Do you think the Washington Post would have investigated that?
Well, on Nicaragua, isn't it ironic today that the leader of the Sandinistas at the time, Daniel Ortega, who the US was at war with, thought was working for the Soviet Union, Cold War, etc., he's back in power in Nicaragua. Right. He's been the elected president of Nicaragua since 2007. So in a way, some might say that all those innocent people who died in Nicaragua, who were murdered at the hands of the Contras, armed and funded by your government, they all died for nothing, really.
How about the ones that died at the hands of the Sandinistas?
But one side doing the killing was backed by you. So how were you bothered by killings that you were helping happen?
By the same way that we were in favor of the Allied forces doing the killing of Germans in World War II.
The Contras are the equivalent to the Allied forces in World War II.
One side was fighting for oppression, one side was fighting for liberation.
Which side was fighting for oppression?
At that time, the Sandinista government was trying to impose a military dictatorship in Nicaragua.
And the Contras were fighting for liberation and freedom.
Yes, they were. And you know what? They won.
Today, people are rightly shocked to see ISIS or ISIL or IS or whatever it calls itself beheading aid workers, raping Yazidi women. It causes huge outrage, and rightly so. Yet in the 80s, you and your government were backing and funding a group, the Contras, which beheaded people, raped women, castrated their opponents, murdered nuns, tortured children. Forget the politics for a moment. I just wonder, how do you morally justify supporting people like that, in moral terms?
Yeah, first of all, I could not morally justify supporting people like that because half of what you just said is simply false.
Edgar Chamorro, former spokesman for the Contras, he testified at the International Court of Justice in '86 that the CIA, quote, organized, armed, equipped, trained, and supplied us. We were told by the CIA that the only way to defeat the Sandinistas was to kill, kidnap, rob, and torture. The former CIA director, Stansfield Turner, testified in Congress that the Contras have to be classified as terrorists, state-sponsored terrorists.
Well, first of all, Stansfield Turner was Jimmy Carter's CIA director.
Oh, so that means he doesn't know anything?
No, he wasn't even there. He was CIA director in the 1970s.
So, Otto, let's make this very simple. You tell me, what did the Contras do wrong? You say they didn't behead, they didn't rape, they didn't castrate. What did they do? You tell me.
In what respect?
What bad things did they do? Or they didn't do anything?
No, I'm sure they did.
Because Congress stopped funding them. They were so worried about the human rights abuses.
Yeah, Congress stopped funding them for domestic political reasons. That's not why Congress stopped funding them. But by the time Congress stopped funding them, they were so strong in Nicaragua that they forced the Sandinistas into an election they did not want to have.
What human rights abuses did the Contras commit?
I'm sure they committed a lot of human rights abuses.
What did they do? You were working then, you must know.
I'm sure they murdered people. Okay. I mean, unfortunately, in war, those things happen. I'm not justifying it.
Even in war.
Absolutely. And if one of them committed a crime, they should be brought to justice.
Most human rights groups
but they were being killed by the Sandinistas. What about...
But they were being armed and funded by you, so you have to take responsibility for those murders.
Oh, so, okay, wait a second. Let me see if I understand. So if the other side, a murderous side, the Soviet Union and Cuba, are funding the Sandinistas who are killing Nicaraguans, we should just sit there and watch the Nicaraguans be killed and not help the Nicaraguans who want to rise?
How do you morally justify the murder, your word, of innocents supported by the U.S. government that you were
The purpose of supporting the Contras was to remove the Sandinistas from power. That was a war. The Sandinistas committed crimes. They killed, they raped,
when I have a supporter of the Sandinistas sitting here, I'll ask them that, but I'm asking a supporter of the Contras to justify their crimes.
When Reagan came in, he saw Nicaragua as part of the...
He called the Contras the moral equivalent of the founding fathers of the U.S. Francisco Dominguez, the Contras, the human rights abuses that I mentioned, they were exaggerated. Some murders were committed, but it was part of a wider war. Your response to that?
The Sandinistas were never forgiven for having overthrown the main supporter, the main ally of the United States in Nicaragua. The Somoza dictatorship that was there for 40 years, that is what actually unleashed the war. This is the most powerful military machine in the world, the United States, supporting a war of attrition against a little country of 3.5 million people. The result was thousands of people, tens of thousands of people dead. And they did arm, they did support, they did train, and so on to the Contras. Everybody knows that there is absolutely ample evidence.
Okay, let me bring in John Dew, former British ambassador in the region. You were there very recently. You retired, I believe, in 2012. What is the legacy of the 80s, of that Reagan period, that Cold War period, on US-Latin American relations today, do you think?
I think it makes it very difficult for the US to get a fair hearing. Things have changed, but the legacy remains. And it's very, very easy to blame the US for all sorts of problems that are not entirely the US's fault. You were talking earlier in the program, General Rios Montt gone to prison. That would have been unthinkable back in the 80s. People can blame the US in Venezuela, when the US record in Venezuela is milk and water compared to what was happening in Central America.
Do you think, Julia Buxton, US gets an unfair hearing in Latin America today because of its history? What's your response to that?
Well, I think another angle also I just wanted to pick up on in terms of Nicaragua was also the relationship with cocaine and the way that the cocaine economy transversed through Central America. All the release documents that we've had from the United States demonstrates that the United States government knew that the Contras were also being funded by the cocaine trade through Central America. So I think in terms of, the US getting an unfair hearing, it's this persistent inability of the US, which is not a monolithic actor. There's lots of different interests in the United States, obviously, but this persistent failure to reflect on these past hurts, on these past legacies. We were talking before about these human rights abuses, Nicaragua, the military dictatorships. There's never been this kind of one-to-one discussion, this meeting of equals, to actually go over these issues of the past and allow for some form of reconciliation. It's this continual, sclerotic US perspective on South America.
Just on that issue, can I ask you that question? You said at the very start of this programme that mistakes were made.
Yes.
Some would say that's an understatement in terms of the dictators who were supported, the crimes that were committed by them. I'm saying, would the United States government, should it apologise to those countries in Latin America for supporting those monsters?
I'm not going to apologise for mistakes that were made by people who made them before I was born. Well,
a lot of it happened on your watch, as we've just been discussing. Rios Montt was in the 80s. Somoza was in the 70s.
We did not support Rios Montt.
Well, okay? Every bit of public evidence suggests otherwise.
Okay, well, why don't we look into
So your
that?
answer is you wouldn't want to apologise?
If you give me a specific, or
You're the one who told me at the beginning there were specific mistakes.
At the beginning of the show, you would have asked me to apologize for giving Orlando Bosch a visa when we did the exact opposite.
That's not what I asked. I asked you to apologize
for
the mistakes that you identified.
Your base of information is wrong. So you got to tell me what it is you want me to apologize for. And if I agree with you that we were in error, and especially in a crime, yes, I think we should.
Okay. Before we go to the audience, and I want to bring in the audience here, one last global question. When you worked for George Bush, one of the things you did was lobby hard for Latin American countries to get behind the war on terror, the war on Iraq, etc. George Bush launched that war on terror in 2001. It's now into its 14th year. Can you say with a straight face that the world is safer today than it was before you launched your war on terror? Because from where I'm sitting, all it's given us is more war and more terror.
I personally can't say the world is safer now.
Why do you think that is?
because there are a lot more evil people than anybody could have anticipated, I suppose. I mean, why have we been, we could have this discussion about every century in human history. I mean,
But the war on terror failed to meet its objectives,
Well, the war on terror is not over, so it can't be said
When will it be over?
I suppose it'll be over when terrorism is eliminated. But it's sort of like the war on poverty.
That's a tactic.
You know, it's like war on poverty.
So
When will it be over? Yeah, possibly never ending.
Great. Okay, let's go to our audience. We've talked about...
But let me ask you, why does it fall on the United States to eliminate all of those evils?
Oh, I can assure you, I don't think a lot of people wanted you to try and eliminate that evil.
Well, we'd be very happy not to have lost all the people that we lost.
And killed a lot of people along the way. Let's bring in our audience here. We'll start with this lady here in the front row. Wait for the microphone to come to you.
I would like you to explain in detail why Cuba is in the list of terrorist countries.
Well, Cuba's on the list of state sponsors of terrorism because it qualifies under the definition of the law, which is that it has supported and continues to support terrorist groups. Look, Cuba was smuggling weapons to North Korea. North Korea is not a democracy. It can be said to be a terrorist state. In fact, it is also on the list of terrorist states. Cuba is an ally of North Korea.
So is China.
No, I don't think China is an ally.
China is not an ally of North Korea.
I don't think China has actually been exerting...
North Korea would collapse tomorrow without the Chinese.
Well, that does... we
You
can
need to think
have
better
this
about your
discussion.
China arguments, because every time I raise China, you don't really have a response.
Well, because China is not an easy...
Because you need China. Let's bring in some other members of the audience. Gentleman at the back of the hall with his glasses. Yes, you.
If Cuba is a terrorist state, why do they hold the peace negotiations, Colombia and Las FARC in Cuba, and which Colombia is an ally of the United States, obviously?
One explanation that I was given for that is that the Cubans offered Havana because they could bug all the rooms and know what everybody was discussing ahead of time, and then passing it to the FARC.
And the US never bug or surveil or spy on anyone, obviously.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Never, never. Edward Snowden, good old Edward. Gentleman there in the third row, yes, with the jacket.
Yeah, you're on public record as being a cheerleader for the former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, who's a serial human rights violator. And it seems to me that you basically support violence of the right against any democratic or left-wing project in Latin America. You've complained about exporting revolution, but you fail to recognize that the people of Latin America themselves want and need revolution against poverty. In fact, you're the one who's exporting counter-revolution all over the continent. You haven't apologized for justifying violence against any political project in a whole continent which you disagree with because it challenges US interests.
I'm not a public cheerleader for anybody, number one. Number two, I want to tell you something about right-wing regimes. My grandparents were killed by the Nazis, and I learned very early on that right-wing killers were just as bad as left-wing killers. I refused to shake the hand of Pinochet at a meeting in Washington in 1977. I refused to shake the hand of Somoza in 75 at a meeting in Tampa, Florida, because they were dictators. They may have been, at that time,
our dictators is the phrase you're looking for.
No, they were not our dictators. We don't have any our dictators.
General Pinochet was not a US supporter.
Do you know the United States imposed sanctions on Pinochet?
Do you know that the United States helped bring Pinochet to power?
Well, let's have a program about that. But I'm not the person to answer that question. But the fact is that I resent your question, sir, because it is false. When I was Assistant Secretary, when Álvaro Uribe was running for office, and one of the things that we needed to know was if all of those allegations that you're repeating were true. And we looked into it, and they were not true.
Forget the former president. We're not going to get into a discussion about the former president.
Do you want to give Uribe a little bit of credit for having, for example, disarmed the paramilitaries that were, along with the FARC, undermining the democracy?
Also accused of having supported those paramilitaries.
Accused by whom?
Well, the US State Department, for example, in 2013 said problems, including extrajudicial unlawful killings in Colombia, including military collaboration with members of illegal armed groups. That's your government said that. The US government said that. Are they liars as well?
No, I don't know what you're... First of all, I'm a little reluctant to accept what you're reading as fact after the Orlando Bosch and some of the other things.
Just deal very quickly with the Colombia point. Colombian military commits massive human rights abuses. Yes or no?
Today?
That's the 2013 US State Department.
If you have evidence of that, I think you should take it to those...
Who should I take it to? The US State Department are the ones who are saying it.
Well, I mean, look...
Otto. Gentleman here. Gentleman here in the jacket, yes.
Regardless of whether or not you are personally involved, do you feel regret or do you even feel guilty of the state today of U.S.-Venezuela relations? And what would you have done or what would you do now differently?
I feel regret. I wish that Hugo Chavez had passed on earlier, and perhaps, which by the way, I don't quite put myself in the position of the person who made that decision, but he died of cancer, as you know. Although, by the way, I've been accused of injecting him with cancer. Maduro actually accused me of injecting Chavez with the cancer that killed him. This shows you the ridiculousness of the allegations.
Maybe that's because the U.S. tried to kill Castro several times, did it not?
Yes, it did. Actually, it did. The U.S. did. And I'm sorry that it failed. Just like, you know, if we had been able to kill Hitler in 1938, we should have, with no regrets. Now, let me just tell you, that had nothing to do with that coup. And what I used to joke at that time is if I had something to do with the coup, it would have probably turned out differently.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the audience. You made your point. That lady here in the front row.
Due to the recently violations of human rights by the Maduro government to student protests, do you think the American government is going to impose sanctions to members of the Venezuelan government?
I think there should be sanctions imposed on those who committed the human rights violations, yes, not on the whole country. The country was not responsible. In fact, the country was the victim. The fact is that since nobody complains about it, the Latin American countries look the other way. They only ask us for help when it's their people being killed. But unfortunately, you know, somebody has given us this great power, you know, as Francisco said, to influence events. And we're going to continue to influence the events in the way that they have been influenced over the last 50 years at least.
Let's go back to the audience. Can I have lady there in the white top?
What are the lessons learned and what is the present-day pertinence of the allegedly failed war on drugs in Latin America?
Oh, there are a number of lessons. In my view, I think that we haven't put enough emphasis on demand, the demand side. Way too much emphasis on the supply side, particularly early on in the 70s. 80s. I think we need to do a lot more to educate people to the damage that the drugs do, not only to their own brain, but to the hemisphere and to the whole world. And I think we should be much more forceful with the people in the United States who benefit from this, the people who become rich from the trafficking of drugs.
I just want to bring in very briefly, Julia Buxton, you've written and lectured on this subject a great deal. How much has the quote-unquote war on drugs, especially in places like Colombia, scarred relations between the United States and Latin America?
Oh, tremendously, and it's created these hugely militarized societies, Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras. And what we've seen is this persistent pattern is that whenever we've had these very harsh, source-focused US supported counter-narcotics operations, for example, in Colombia, it simply shifted the trade into Peru. So there's been a clampdown in Peru and it shifted to Bolivia. So there's been this constant chasing around of the drug trade of the region. Now we've got to the point today where cocaine use in the United States has actually fallen, but the most recent World Drug Report says that the largest drug consumed currently in the United States of America is amphetamine. So the United States has essentially become a self-supporting, drug-producing nation.
I want to go to this gentleman here with the beard.
Imagine I was a younger colleague of yours rising through the ranks of United States foreign policy making, and seeking your advice, I were to tell you, I'm having trouble sleeping at night because of this moral contradiction I have between wanting to promote United States foreign policy values and discourse on democracy and human rights, but ending up pursuing United States interests instead throughout the region.
I would say that if you had been working with me in the State Department at the time, you would have had a lot better information than what we've heard here tonight. And you wouldn't be having trouble sleeping because you would know what this editor from the Washington Post told me 25 years later, that instead of us killing nuns or torturing children, we were trying to do what in fact we did, which was to build a political center, isolate the violent extremes in places like Salvador and Nicaragua to allow democracy to take hold. These are not easy grounds on which to plant democracy.
Otto, you've already conceded yourself that some of those groups you're supporting carried out murders. Are you saying that never weighs on your conscience, never bothers you, you're totally fine?
No, I mean, but I also told you that you're drawing a false moral equivalence.
It's a very simple question. Yes or no? Does it bother you what the Contras did?
I told you, yes. If they committed murders.
Not if. You said they committed murders, Otto. There's no if. You said it. It's on tape.
Yes, if they committed murder, it's on my conscience.
Okay, good. That was real hard to get out of you. Let's try this gentleman here in the second row.
Hi. Given the great success of US policy in Colombia, fighting the war on terror, fighting the war on drugs, improving respect for the rule of law and for human rights, how do you feel that can be replicated across the whole region when so many South American leaders use the US as a political punching bag?
That's what all the left all over the world does. Blame America first. But when the United States withdraws, what happens? When it withdraws from the stage, what happens?
They elect governments who cut poverty.
Really?
Just a suggestion.
Give me an example.
Venezuela. Let's go back to the audience. Lady there, who I promised a question.
Look at the figures.
Lady there, has she got a microphone?
American corporations have come under serious scrutiny in Latin America for both collaborating with left and right governments and committing human rights violations, and also committing those human rights violations themselves in order to forward their gains in the region. What do you think the response should be from the U.S. government in order to curtail and regulate this behavior, even if it occurs outside the United States?
I think that if they're responsible for violating human rights, they should be sanctioned. They should be punished. As a government official, you're sort of at odds in both supporting the economic presence of U.S. industry and pursuing foreign policy interests.
Sadly, we've run out of time. I want to ask one last question to you. As I said, you worked for 3 different presidents. You've been involved at the heart of Latin American foreign policy. What is your biggest single regret?
I thought you were going to ask me, what was your biggest single victory?
You really misunderstood this show when you came on.
Not at all.
Good. What's your number one regret, looking back over the 35 years that you've been there?
Absolutely. My biggest single regret is that we did not get rid of more dictatorships, right or left. A big regret is not having done more in terms of corruption. The level of corruption in Latin America is hard for this audience to understand unless you come from one of those countries. If you come from one of those countries, you know what I'm talking about. And I think we should have known more about that event in Venezuela that removed Hugo Chavez. Certain things happen in Venezuela that we could not control. Even if Francisco thinks we're Superman and we control everything, we don't.
Sadly, we've run out of time. Otto, thank you very much for coming on Head to Head today. Thank you very much to our panel coming here and joining us. Thanks to our audience here in the Oxford Union for joining us. Thanks to you all for watching at home. Head to Head will be back on Al Jazeera English next week. Good night.